chapter 20, starting in verse 19. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies, who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able, in the presence of the people, to catch him in what he said. But marveling at his answer, they became silent.
The last few weeks we've been talking about Jesus' authority and the way that the scribes and the Pharisees and those religious authorities of the day began to question his authority. We know that Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth. We know that God has given him great authority. We know that during the time he was here, he had authority to cast out demons. He had authority to heal the blind. He had authority to heal the sick. He had authority to do all kinds of things that he wanted to do. And yet they question his authority here at the end, and that's what's going on. He got through talking about authority when they questioned his authority by giving this parable that we studied last week, this parable about the wicked vine dressers. This idea that they were given an assignment, they were given a task, and they didn't follow through on the task. Rather than following through on the task, they decided to take to task those who came to correct them, those who came to collect the monies and such, and eventually even to the point of killing the son and heir so that they could take it for themselves. And he applied that, not with his own words, but by the way he said it, in such a way that they knew he was talking about them, the religious leaders. And they hated him for it. They absolutely despised him for it, and it says that they decided that they were going to plot to try to kill him. And so that's where we're at. It's, and as soon as he says that part about the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief corner, and upon anyone who stumbles over it will stumble, and anybody will fall, and anybody upon whom it falls will crush or break into pieces, depending on what translation you're reading from. They knew that he was talking about them. And verse 19 of our reading today begins with those words. They perceived that he had told this parable against them. So we're going to look at this. He's thwarted their leaders in trying to challenge his authority, and they're humiliated and they're angry, and they're going to step back for a minute. Instead of personally attacking Jesus and failing, because every time they try to personally attack Jesus, he beats them. And so now they decide they're going to try to trick him. They want him so badly that they're plotting every idea they can. They're doing everything they can to say, this guy's wrong and we're going to get him. And they've decided they're going to get him no matter what it is. And so they come up with something that nobody likes to talk about, and that's taxes. Nobody likes to talk about taxes at all, so they say, we'll trick him with a question about taxes. And it goes a whole lot deeper than that. The idea was that whatever Jesus said, they would be able to twist it around and to make it look like he was in rebellion against the Roman authorities. That's what their plan was. That rebellion against the Roman authorities would result in his arrest and very possibly his death. They had a pretty good idea what they were trying to do here, and in answer to this spiritual trap, Jesus gives them a lesson on the things of God and the things of Caesar. Our requirements to our community and our requirements to our Lord. Our life in the world and our life as children of God. And there's some differences there. And he talks about that, and he thwarts their efforts. But let's look at this as it begins. It starts off with their deception. Verse 19 is very clear there. They want to destroy him. It says, scribes and chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived he had told this parable against them. But listen to why they didn't do it. They feared the people. They're infuriated from the previous teachings. They're infuriated from the previous parable. They're infuriated at the idea that Jesus claims to have this authority. They're infuriated that Jesus questions their authority. They want him dead. They want him dead so much because they believe they are right. They're righteous and he's not. They're so righteous that they're afraid to do anything about it. You ever thought about that perspective? You ever thought about that perspective? They're so right that they don't want to speak up. Really? I would think if you were right, you would want to speak up. I would think that if you were righteous, if you were standing up for God, you would stand up for God. But no, they're afraid of the people. They're not afraid of the Romans. They're afraid of the followers of God. There's a whole thing here, a whole lesson that we might not even see if we don't look at it entirely and in its entirety. They want to arrest him and put him to death, but they won't do it because he's popular. Well, we don't want to do anything right now because he's real popular and people won't like that. And we don't want them, to rebel against Rome? No, that's not their concern. We don't want them to rebel against us. We don't want any of the consequences for what we're about to do. We hate him, we want him dead, but we don't want to have to face the consequences ourselves. As a matter of fact, later on when we're reading in Acts, they get angry at Stephen and they stone Stephen because Stephen says, you're the ones that did it. And they didn't like that answer at all. And so we see them here, we see their true nature. And in verse 20, we know that it's going to be a hostile encounter. They watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere so that they might catch him in something that he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. Do you see what's going on here? They're not only just watching him, they're plotting, they're sending spies so that they can deliver him to the governor. It's not anymore about delivering him to the council. It's about getting him dead. That's what it's all about. They're trying to do that. So they plot and they plead and they get the guys that are going to do it. And matter of fact, later on at his trial, some of those false witnesses are going to say, well, he said not to pay taxes to Caesar. Which is not what he said here at all. But some of these same people are going to rear their ugly head again later on as we study this. And they're hoping to catch him in some teaching that would alienate the crowd. You know, that's what they would really like to do. Or some teaching that would put him in trouble with the government so he could be dead. And they're trying to collect further evidence against him because he just won't give up what they want. Because he's living a perfect life. They can't find anything to accuse him on. And so they're trying to do that. And it's no new thing for bad people to represent themselves as good people. You know, even Satan can quote Scripture. It's no new thing for bad people to try to pretend to be just to promote whatever they're trying to do. And so that's what these guys are doing. You know, if Paul writes that the devil could appear as an angel of light, how much more people that decide, hey, you know what, I can talk a good talk as a Christian and lead people astray. It happens all the time. I hear things and see things from people who wear the name Christian and the lives they live and the lies they tell are far from the Word of God. I wonder about those things sometimes. But that's not what's really going on here. They're not unintentionally leading people away from God. They're intentionally trying to find a way to catch Jesus in his words in a plot so that they can deliver him over to the authorities and have him punished, silenced, stopped. That's what they're trying to do. And so, in verse 21, they ask what appears to be a sincere question. You know, if you're just in the crowd and you don't know what the background is, if you're just sitting there and you're in the audience and Jesus is there and the scribes come up and these people come up there, you don't know that they've got a plot going on. You don't know that they're trying to trick Jesus. You don't know what the backstory is. All you hear is what sounds like a sincere question. I mean, it starts off with flattery. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but teach the Word of God. You know, that kind of flattery could get a lot of people in trouble. A lot of times we might fall for something like that when somebody starts to flatter us a little bit. But you know, and it's funny that they were right. I mean, they were correct when they said he was an impartial teacher and speaker of the truth. That's exactly what he was. He was an impartial teacher, and he was teaching the truth. But their motives are deceptive, and the flattery's like, you know, other places where they call him, oh, we know that you're a prophet from God. We know that you're a teacher from God. But they don't believe what he says, and they don't believe what he does. And here they're just trying to catch him in the words. And so they come up with this innocent question. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? There's the question. Is it legal for a Jewish citizen to support a pagan government? That's the question. You know, in the day and society we live in today, we don't see that necessarily because we don't think about the terms and ramifications of the question. Their tax dollars that they gave to Rome were going to be used to build temples to idols. Their tax dollars that they gave to Rome were going to be used to conquer other countries and peoples. The tax dollars that they used to Rome were going to be used to conscript their own children into the Roman army. Oh yeah, it's an evil government. Should they give their money to support an evil government? That's the question that's being asked here. You know, they want to make him lose favor with the people because they want him to answer this question. The Romans had a really unpopular tax they had imposed on the people of Israel. It started, it was a 10% tax like most of the other people that they taxed. And what had happened was, during the course of a few minor rebellions that had happened among the Jews, the Romans had decided to impose stricter taxes because if they've got less free money, they've got less money for a rebellion. And so the tax rate was 33%. 1/3 of everything you got went to the government, the Roman government. Now, if you're remembering your Hebrew history, which I wasn't until I started doing the research for the lesson. So I'll say maybe you don't know that. Judd probably does because he knows everything. But for the rest of us, just in case you're not sure and you don't remember, you were already giving 1/3 of your income to the temple and to the Hebrew authorities. So now that means 2/3 of your income's gone off the top. And they didn't get a tax refund at the end of the year, and they didn't get a stimulus check. Those things were not coming their way. They were hurting under the burden of the Roman tax system. They hated this. And worse yet, the money was being used to build temples in Jerusalem to Roman gods. They got to see the effects of their taxes. They got to see the Roman soldiers in their scarlet uniforms as they walked around. And it wasn't just the taxes. Oh no, there was much more to it than that. If a Roman soldier decided he wanted to sleep at your house tonight, guess what? He got your bed. You went and slept with your kids or your dogs. And he could stay there however long he wanted to. And you had no say in it. By the way, guess who gets to eat first in the morning? Your wife's going to get up and cook for him whether she does for the rest of the family or not. No matter what her other obligations are, she's going to serve that Roman soldier that's staying in your house, whether you want her to, whether you want him to, or not. And it goes a step further. As soon as he decides to leave the house for the day, you or your son or your daughter is going to pick up all of his things and carry them for him. And you don't have any say in that. That's in addition to paying the taxes. So they were not happy about this Roman tribute. So this question that seems sort of innocuous to us today, 2,000 years later, wasn't at all to them innocuous. In fact, for them, this is life or death. It's literally the difference sometimes between eating and not eating. They're hating the tax. You know, was it legal to support a pagan government with God's money? You know, how often do we hear the same question from some of our people today about our government? Oh, I don't agree with this particular policy of our government, so I don't want to pay taxes. Or I don't agree with that particular leader in our government, so I don't want to pay my taxes. So it's okay to cheat on our taxes if we don't agree, right? No, it's not. That's what Jesus said. It doesn't matter whether we agree with it or not. We have obligations to Caesar, and we're going to get to that as we do this. This particular tax even challenged, to some extent, the law of Moses because of the indications and implications of it going to a false deity. You can't give to a false deity. And yet it's going there, and you know it's going there. Neither answer was safe. If Jesus says pay the taxes, then he's basically blaspheming. He's saying don't support God, support these pagan images. And the people are going to be mad because they have to pay the money that they don't want to pay and put up with the things that they don't want to put up with, so they're going to be mad. But if he says don't pay the taxes, the Roman government is going to charge him with treason. And if they charge him with treason, they're going to put him in jail and they're going to put him to death. So there's no win. There's no possible way out of this that they can see. They've laid the perfect trap. But then we see verses 23 through 26 that Jesus is aware of their duplicity. He knows what they're doing. He knows their hearts. They can pretend to be as sincere as they want to pretend to be, but he knows their hearts. And so he'll answer them in verse 24 after he sees it. Verse 23 says, he perceived their craftiness, and he said to them, verse 24, show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. Now he's seen their skillful disguise. He's seen through it. He understands that their question is a dangerous snare. He sees through that as well. And he didn't give them a direct answer, but he gave them a lesson. You know, it's kind of interesting. He asked for a piece of money that they used. Now, they used this money for everything. This particular money, the Roman government required it. One of the things when you study in your classes at Christian universities or places like that, when you start studying about why was it the right time for Jesus to come, one of the things that they had was they had the peace of Rome, they had the Roman roads which allowed the gospel to spread, and they had a common currency that allowed everybody to do business the same way and with the same coin. And so there's the coin, and so he knows that, and they reach in a handbag because everybody's got one, and they pull it out and they say, well, it's Caesar's coin. They know it's Caesar's coin because a denarius is a small silver coin, is about what you earned for a day's labor. If you were a laborer, it was a denarius. So everybody would earn one each day as they worked. So everybody had one. And as they looked at it, you would see on one side a picture of Tiberius Caesar, and on the other side you would read the inscription, Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus. Now let that sink in for just a minute. Son of divine Augustus. Every time you got paid, that coin reminded you that Augustus Caesar, by the way, who was the emperor when Jesus was born? In the days of Caesar Augustus? That Augustus Caesar was a god. That's what the coin said that you used. Every single time you got paid, every single time you went to buy something, you had that picture of Tiberius Caesar and the words, Son of Divine Augustus. The very words on the coin were offensive to the Jews. The very image on the coin was offensive to the Jews. This coin is idolatry. And yet they used it all the time. They didn't have any problem using the coin in their business. They didn't even have any problems at all buying and selling using these coins. That wasn't really a problem until today when it's questioned. They're obligated to Caesar because they're using his coins. In verse 25, Jesus shows the hypocrisy of it right there. He says, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. You know, the text indicates here that Jesus gave human government, that's Caesar, a legitimate role in divine government of creation. I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we forget that government does have a role in the world. Sometimes we think, well, there's a separation between church and state. There's a wall between the church and the state. And the reason for that is because we live in a country, the only country in the history of the world, that set out with the fundamental thing that government could not get involved in the affairs of the church. Now, it didn't say church can't get involved in the affairs of the government. In fact, it says that the church didn't get involved in the affairs of the government, that the government would fail. They wanted the church involved in affairs of government, but no government involvement in the affairs of the church. And so as we look at this and we read this, we see that that's exactly what Jesus is saying. We're part of a worldly world while we live, even though we're part of a heavenly kingdom while we live. We live in two different worlds at the same time as Christians, and we need to live in peace in both. Paul writes, and we'll turn over to Romans 13, share with you what Paul writes here. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now listen to what he says. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. Those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he's the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And he goes on to talk about why you pay taxes. For this reason you pay taxes. You know, I think sometimes we forget about that. I think sometimes we say, well, you know, good rulers are appointed by God, but I'm not so sure about bad rulers. When Paul wrote this letter to the church in Rome, Nero was the emperor. Nero, the one who would take Christians and stand them in a vat of oil and then set them on fire to light up the orgies that he had. And they would burn for hours before they died sometimes. And Paul says he is ordained by God for your good. There's your one to try to figure out. You want a deep theological question? Try to figure that one out, because I don't have the answer to that. But Paul says it was true. And he says we're responsible as a result. Over in Peter, in 2 Peter, we'll flip over there, 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 2, that's why I got to 2 Peter. Starting in verse 13, Peter writes these words, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Back in the early days of communist China, there was a great outburst of outrage by the Communist Party against Christianity. They were trying to throw Christians out left and right. They wanted to destroy Christianity completely. There was a guy who had been a missionary there for several years. His name was George Benson. George Benson was a very good, strong, religious man, devout in all his ways, who went to the Chinese government and explained to them this verse, which says, if you allow people to be Christians, they'll be better citizens. If you allow Christians to act in the way they're supposed to act, they won't be leading insurrections against your government. In fact, they'll be submissive to your government, and they will follow all the ways that they're supposed to follow. And it stopped the persecution. The Chinese government never accepted the idea that you could be a Christian and still be a communist. Well, no, they still don't accept that. But they did stop persecuting the Christians for a time because of the words that are found in the teachings to the Christians by Peter, which is the same thing Jesus said. So Jesus said, yes, pay your taxes. Honoring God doesn't mean you don't pay taxes, so since you use Caesar's money for commerce, you use Caesar's money to pay your taxes. That's not a problem with that. Jesus didn't have a problem with that. And not to mention, they kind of liked the idea of the peace that Rome provided. They kind of liked the idea of the protection Rome provided. There was no Babylon coming in to attack them, or Egypt coming in to attack them, or someone else coming in to attack them, because whoever it was would have to go to war with Rome. They kind of appreciated the protection of Rome. So they had to give to Rome, to Caesar, the things that belonged to Caesar. Government, even when we disagree with government, should be supported by us. That's what he's saying. But then, just in case they thought that was the end of it, Jesus went ahead and added another thought. He quantified this by saying, you know what? But also render to God the things that are God's. Well, no, wait a minute. Give to God what belongs to Him. Where does worship go? It goes to God. Where does love go? It goes to God. Where does adoration go? It goes to God. Where does praise go? It goes to God. Where does the following of God's will go? It follows God. It goes to God. And sometimes when they look at that coin and it says on there that Tiberius is the son of Augustus, the divine Augustus, that's not true. That's not true. They still use the coin, but they're not worshiping Augustus, they're worshiping God. And that's what Jesus is trying to remind them, that everything, even though you follow the world that we live in, you're a part of a kingdom that's not of this world. He's trying to teach them something that they need to know about the authority of the state of God, and that there's an allegiance that belongs to God alone and can clash with the principles of the world. As a matter of fact, we see Peter and John being chastised, being beaten, because they're teaching about Jesus. And their response is, we ought to obey God rather than men. We ought to obey God rather than men. And so they do that. So that brings up a question. Here's Jesus' teaching to them 2,000 years ago. What if the government begins to delve into our private lives today? I mean, what if the government starts getting into our private lives like it got into their private lives? One of my favorite writers is H. Leo Bowles. I disagree with him in some areas, but he was one of my favorite writers of all time. And he believed that Christians were to love their enemies, and he firmly believed that thou shalt not kill applied to any situation. And so the result was, he believed that Christians couldn't fight in World War I. And he wrote about that. He wrote against the Christians fighting for World War I. Not only could they not fight, they couldn't register for the draft. And since they couldn't register for the draft, neither could they vote. And so that's what he taught. And he taught that to all his students at the university where he was president. He taught that to all the churches where he went around to speak, and he believed that, and he wrote about it, and he taught that with all his heart. And as much as I like his writing and scholarship in so many areas, I disagree with him there. During the Roman occupation of Palestine, the Jews were required to support the Roman army. There's no doubt about that. If someone forces you to go with him 1 mile, go with him a second mile also. That's direct words of Jesus. He's teaching that specifically. Pay taxes to support this government. He's teaching those things. Paul and Peter and Jesus, even in the midst of all of these things going on, never said not to participate with the Roman government. Your children were subject to the Roman government. If they decided they were going to have a war in Egypt and they needed soldiers, they would come around and they would take one child from every family. And you're in the army now. That's the way they conscripted people into the army. And if you didn't like that, that's just too bad. But did you ever hear Peter or Paul or Jesus or James or Luke or Matthew or Mark or any of the other writers say that that was wrong and that they shouldn't go and serve? No, rather what you see over and over and over again is give honor to the king and render the service that you're due. And so they did that. So when I look at it, I see a very clear teaching there that our duties to the government, even when we don't like the ones in authority, extend into the way we live our daily lives. They do. Peter says we do it because we're showing the glory of God in our lives. We're honoring them because it shows the power of God in our lives. So what Jesus is saying here is it's too simple to try to just make a distinction in the question. That coin has two sides. There's the worldly side that we live in, and there's the heavenly side that we belong to. And we need to live responsibly with both of our obligations. You know, their response is recorded in verse 26. Here's what they thought. They were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, became silent. They didn't have a response. How did you get out of this? There's no possible way. They didn't expect that kind of answer, so they marveled at his answer because they couldn't latch on to something to get him. Interestingly enough, again, later on in chapter 23, we're going to see them use his non-answer as him saying not to pay taxes to Caesar. He didn't say that, did he? No, he didn't say that. But they're going to use that. Once again, in their attempt to trap Jesus, they only show his wisdom. You know, they tried to trick him, but he's wiser than they are. Another way to get Jesus has to be found. Why is he so wise? Why is he so wise? Because his heart is true to God. And the wisdom of God's greater than the wisdom of men. You know, when our hearts are true to God, when we're following God with all our hearts, when we're following him with all our wisdom, and we're using his wisdom in our daily decisions, we'll be wise as well. That's what he's saying here simply. So how does it apply to us? Does our government require us to pay taxes and obey laws and live like good citizens? Yep. Are we supposed to do that? Yep. You know, unless it interferes with following God, do we still need to follow Jesus' words to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's? Yes. Do we need to follow the other part of his words to render unto God the things that are God's? Yep. And I think therein we fail more than we do in the other. I think therein we often find ourselves forgetting to praise and sing and glorify and honor God. And yet that's a big part of that. Do we daily commit ourselves to following him? Jesus says, take up your cross daily and follow me. Are we following Christ's teaching with all our heart? Are we? Is His will our will? Are we doing the things He wants us to do? Are we rendering to God the things that are His? Listening to His Word, believing what He says, repenting of our own way of life and turning our lives over to Him? Are we confessing daily our faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God? Are we willing, have we been willing, to be baptized into Christ and to name Him Lord of our life for our entire life? And are we continuing to live that faith day by day, confessing Him by the way we live, day by day showing our faith by the way we live? If you need anything from the Lord today, whether you want to respond in baptism, it's time to become a child of God, whether you want to respond in a need for prayers that you have in your life, whether you need to recommit yourself, whatever it is you might need, if you'll come while we stand and sing to encourage you.